I'm joined today by Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, who is professor of psychology at the University of Toronto in Canada, as well as a clinical psychologist. He's catalyzed, I guess what I'm calling, Professor, both support and opposition because of your reaction to, really two things. A bill in Canada called C-16, which would amend the Canadian Human Rights Code and Criminal Code to add gender identity and expression, and its impact directly and indirectly, I guess, with regard to how you would address students in some of your classes. So that's the way that I sort of understand the controversy, but I'll allow you to sort of present how this started and what your position is.
Well, it started when I looked into some of the new legislation that the federal government was considering passing, similar to legislation that already exists provincially in a number of provinces in Canada. And it purports only to add gender identity and gender, I can't remember the other one, gender expression to the code. But it's going to be interpreted in the context of other policies that have been created by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, for example. And there's a couple of problems with those in my estimation. And the first is that there's an insistence in the law of a technical separation between biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual preference. Mm-hmm. And that's a hypothesis that you might consider a social constructionist hypothesis. It's based on the idea that there's no biological basis to, let's say, gender identity. Not speaking about gender expression is actually more like fashion. It's the manner in which you choose to present yourself in public with your hair and your makeup and your clothing and so forth. And so that's a protected group now as well, although I fail to see how gender expression constitutes a group at all. But anyways, back to gender identity.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think it's true that gender identity and biological sex are independent in the way that the social constructionists insist. They believe that everything that distinguishes men and women is a consequence of socialization and nothing else. And the fact that that's now written into the law, I think, is very dangerous because it does things, and this has already happened at the University of Oregon, it does things like call into question even the legality of presenting biological information that bears on differences between men and women. And then the other, and I think that's a very big problem because I think that the law is technically incorrect. There's a very tight linkage in most cases between biological sex and gender identity, given that transgender identity is very rare, perhaps one person in 300. So for the vast majority of people, their gender identity and their biological sex are identical. And so I fail to see how that constitutes independence. So, and then the next problem, as far as I can tell, is that this is the first example that I've seen in Canadian law of what you might describe as compelled speech. And so it's possible to argue that certain forms of speech should be limited in a free country, although I think you have to be very careful about that. I mean, various countries, including Canada, have hate speech legislation. You're in the US, I believe, is that correct? Yes, well, in the US, there's much tighter protection for freedom of speech. But let's assume for a moment that some limitations could arguably be placed on what you can't, so to regulate what you can't say. But this is the first law that I know of that actually forces you to use a particular terminology that's now government approved. And you may or may not know that there is a very large plethora of so-called gender neutral pronouns that have been devised. There's no consensus on what those should be.
Yeah, so let's pause there because there's sort of a lot there. And what I think because there's been so much controversy generated by your reaction to this, and I've seen, a number of interviews that you've done about this, I'd like to take the approach of maybe starting to rule out what some of your concerns are, because some of the criticisms of you have been along the lines of, well, Jordan Peterson is just transphobic, for example, or Jordan Peterson is against the non-existent problem of political correctness. And that's really the angle that he's coming at this from. So let's see if we can just start ruling out what some of the issues may be. With regard to transphobia, you said that 1 in 300 was the number you cited in terms of the prevalence of transgender. Do you consider yourself someone who believes in any other area that discrimination against someone who identifies as transgender, for example, a business refusing service to someone on the basis of being transgender, is anything like that okay in your mind?
No.
It's not. Okay. So with regard to the issue,
I think it's
I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think it's complicated for business owners often to manage the washroom problem, and I feel for them because it isn't always obvious when someone is indeterminate, say in gender status, to determine how that should be treated, especially in relation to the reactions of other customers. So I think it's difficult for business people often to determine and then to do what the right thing might be. So, but I'm certainly not in favor of arbitrary discrimination.
Okay. And with regard to the concept of transsexuality, there are some articles written, and you're free to cite them if you want. I won't, because you may not agree with them, and why, if this is just a non-starter, why publicize articles that may be inaccurate? Do you believe that transsexuality as an idea is either part of a leftist agenda or ideologically driven or in any way created to sort of push back against cisgendered individuals? Does any of that ring a bell with you or feel accurate?
I don't think that the transgender phenomena is a construction of political correctness, because there have been people who have had difficulty with their, let's say, biological sex identity for a very long period of time, long before political correctness became an issue. So it's not reasonable to attribute the phenomena itself to political correctness, but the idea that the activist end of this agenda is part of a politically correct movement, I think is undeniable. It's part of a broader postmodern movement that is aimed at questioning every normative, I would say, category. And I mean, I've had letters from very many transgendered individuals, by the way. The classic transgendered types don't really have a problem with pronoun use. They just, classical pronoun use, they just want to be referred to by the other pronoun. So a male to female transsexual wants to be referred to as she, and a female to male transsexual wants to be referred to as he. Mm-hmm. And assuming that, I had quite a long conversation with one such person that's on my website, Jordan Peterson Videos, and so if people are interested, they can look into that. So I'm not attributing the phenomena itself to political correctness, but I am pointing out that the use of the transgender population by a certain type of, let's call them Marxist / postmodern ideologue, is part of a broader ideologically motivated attempt to deconstruct, that's the technical word, normative categories.
And what would be the goal of that, I guess, would be my question. In what would be the goal of this Marxist politically correct movement, and in what way would this specific aspect of transgenderism sort of be part of that?
Well, I think the stated goal, if you read about postmodernists, most of them were French intellectuals in the 1970s. They transmuted Marxism. Once Marxism had been shown to fail, essentially, by the absolute catastrophe, say, of the Soviet Union, where there were so many millions of deaths, and also the same thing happened in China and a variety of other places, it became quite obvious, particularly to a group of French intellectuals that included Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, for example, mm-hmm. that Marxism as constituted, which was the working class, say, against the ruling class, wasn't going to fly, partly because capitalist countries had actually managed to increase the living standards of working class people quite dramatically. And so they performed a sleight of hand in the 1970s and shifted the battle from economic warfare to identity warfare, assuming that all normative categories, heterosexuality, for example, um, classic gender divisions, were power structures that were designed only to marginalize people. And the aim of deconstructionism is to replace the center, let's say, the classic normative structure, with the marginalized. And it's a very, I would say, a subversive intellectual movement. I don't think there's any question about that. The people who are the main thinkers of the movement regard themselves as seriously subversive. They don't like Western civilization. They regard it as oppressive and patriarchal. I mean, anytime you hear someone using the word patriarchy, then you can be sure that they're under the sway of postmodern ideas. And the more radical postmodernists, and you see them particularly in fields like women's studies and all the ethnic studies groups that have disciplines that have been generated since the late 70s, their goals are quite straightforward. They want to reconstruct the patriarchy. And so the patriarchy basically means our civilization as it currently stands, which they regard as irreparably corrupt.
Let me pause there if I can, only because we have limited time, of course, because you do have to get to a class, and we're starting to drift a little bit from maybe what was the main focus of it. Let me cut to the chase as I see it and see what your thought on this is. I think that there's a very good possibility here that you're presenting the superior argument with regard to the C-16 bill in Canada. However, I'm wondering, from a purely pragmatic perspective, whether you'd not have more support in terms of your position on C-16 if you didn't communicate what, and I'll be very upfront with you in terms of the way I interpret it, and I don't think I'm the only one, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but just as an analysis of how I see it. Significant level of hostility towards transgender individuals as a separate issue from that of gender neutral pronouns. I'm wondering, and I'll give you a chance to respond, of course, whether if a student requests an accommodation with regard to a pronoun, even if you don't think that this makes any sense, even if many people don't think that it makes any sense, might not making some effort to go forward with that accommodation put you on much stronger footing then for your opposition to C-16 and the sort of legislation of this type of language? I'm thinking out loud. I don't know what you think.
Well, I don't know if it would put me on stronger footing. It would certainly be easier, I can tell you that. It isn't obvious to me that the appropriate thing to do when you're compelled to use words that you don't agree with, that the right thing to do is to go ahead and use them. So I regard the made-up pronouns, the je and jure and so forth, as part of the vanguard of this postmodern movement. And
sure, but in what way are you hurt by just doing that? If it makes a student more comfortable, if it makes them take more away from the class, because as they see it, not as you see it, maybe not as I see it, but as they see it, they're being addressed in the way that they want to be addressed. In what way is that jeopardizing you or your teaching or the material in class, for example?
Well, I don't think there's any evidence that it will make things better for them. It's just a supposition. In fact, I think that the demand to be marked out with the special use of pronouns, which, by the way, don't change very frequently in the English language, they're very fixed words. I think the demand backed by law to be marked out in some special way is not something that's going to make anyone feel better, except perhaps very temporarily. And I think it's a bad medium to long-term strategy.
But that's your opinion, right? I mean, in other words, if we have the opinion about that from the person who is actually making the request and the opinion of someone who merely is refusing to use it, should we not at least give equal weight, if not more, to the opinion? Again, we're talking about two opinions of the person directly affected. I don't know. Again, I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm not even saying I agree with these pronouns.
Well, the issue here is that I think the danger of using legislated language, especially that's part of a philosophical battle, let's call it an intense intellectual battle that's going on in the university campuses and that will increasingly flood out into the normative world outside the campus. I think that ceding control over language to your ideological opponents, let's say, is a large mistake. I regard the postmodern philosophy, the radical postmodern philosophy, as something that is exceedingly dangerous, and the Marxism that it's nested inside, which I'm not imagining. Derrida, for example, stated clearly that his philosophy was a transmutation of Marxism that was nested inside it. I think that if you cede verbal territory to your ideological opponents, then you lose. And you might say, well, does it matter if you're hurting someone's feelings? And of course, hurting someone's feelings is a bad thing if you can avoid it. But losing in a very important ideological battle is a much worse thing. And I don't think that people understand the seriousness of this battle, although they will come to understand it over the next few years as it continues to play itself out. I mean, part of the reason that the American election tilted the way it did was because a relatively small number of people, and there are multiple reasons, of course, were tired of politically correct demands. And the problem with the postmodernists is that whenever they want to make a move forward in their attempts to undermine the categorical structure of the patriarchy, they always pick a victim group and to use as a front so that they can claim that what they're doing is motivated by compassion and that their enemies are bigots and horrible people. And I think that that's a absolutely awful way of maneuvering politically, although it's extraordinarily effective.
Yeah, I
And
don't
as
know
I
how
said,
effective it is. I mean, I think in many ways, identity politics is increasingly not effective, and I've been hugely critical, in fact, of the American left for the use of that to the extent that they do. I just go back to the idea that I believe your criticism of C16 would be seen much more favorably if maybe you appeared less, and I know you're saying you're not actually hostile to transgender individuals, if you appeared less hostile to transgender
well, that
individuals through your class.
you could make that case, but look, it's a mystery why what I did attracted so much attention, right? Because all I did was make 2 videos and put them up on my YouTube site.
Yeah.
They weren't particularly well produced, but they produced an absolute storm of controversy, far more than I would have ever hoped for, and far more than I would have ever wanted. I believe the reason that they produced the controversy is actually because I took something that's a universal problem, which is this ideological battle, and I made it about something extraordinarily specific, which was my specific refusal to use these made up words. And so that's produced somewhat of a backlash, although I've received, at least in terms of the letters that I've received, far more support, and more support too from the press, at least in Canada, than criticism. And in an issue like this, you're going to generate some criticism and some support. And so far, mostly what I've generated is support. And it's conceivable that someone else could have done a better job of this. And it's conceivable as well that I could have done a better job of it. But it's an element of conscience for me not to use these postmodern neo-Marxist language, because I've studied history quite intently, and I understand the dangers both of postmodernism and of the Marxist philosophy within which it's based. And I've read very much about how societies start to tilt in pathological directions, and one way they start is by transmutation of language. And so there's always a price to be paid if you stand up for something, because there's proximal consequences, and the proximal consequences are that it appears that I'm hurting the feelings of some transgender people, although it isn't really clear to me that that's the case, especially given that I've received far more letters of support from transgender people than letters of criticism.
Yeah.
It's not self-evident that the people who are the activists on behalf of the transgender population are their appropriate representatives. Who says that they're speaking for them? It's just a claim, and I don't buy it. And so I'll use their proper names, which the Ontario Human Rights Commissioner agreed was acceptable.
All
And
right,
I'm not
Dr. Jordan
being,
Peterson, I know you have to run. I wish we had more time. I would love to have you back and we can talk about this again in the future. We've been speaking with Professor Jordan B. Peterson. Thanks so much for talking to me.
thanks very much for having me.